Welcome to the Countertop podcast. This is a podcast where we go around talking about certain topics. It can be funny, comical, sad, depressing, all over the place. Um, we are currently posting on Apple Music, Spotify, as well as some of the other smaller sites. Basically, anywhere you guys are streaming right now, you can probably listen to us, as well as YouTube. Also, we do have social media on Instagram and Twitter, so make sure you go and follow us there for any updated information, new postings, so on and so forth. This week's episode is going to be a little bit different. We are going to be doing a deep dive. Normally, each week we kind of take random topics, I'll bring them to the table. This one, we're going to dive a little more heavily into one topic. And to start us off, I'll just give you the floor, Tanner.
Sure. So, last week we talked a little bit about CRISPR. CRISPR, and specifically the Cas9 genome editing technology that has kind of hit it was a new Netflix documentary came out, I believe it was last month. In addition to this technology being awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 2020, it's kind of been in the front news. And so we wanted to talk a little about what is it? And by the way, those press seltzer waters are amazing. You got me turned on to those.
Press. We're not sponsored.
Yeah. No, it's good stuff. But anyway, so what is CRISPR? CRISPR is clustered regularity interspaced short palindromic repeats. So what does that mean? Essentially, what's really interesting about CRISPR, and because CRISPR itself does not allow us to do gene editing, right? It's the specific Cas9 protein that we're looking at. But CRISPR is it was described in a TED Talk by one of the founders. The lady had a nice one that I listened to. And essentially what it is that when bacteria becomes in contact with the virus, a DNA replica in the form of RNA can be reproduced, and from that RNA sequence, you could use the CRISPR technology and the Cas9 protein to specifically target and otherwise modify, kind of like a pair of scissors, DNA strains. They describe RNA as kind of like a report card, or otherwise like a vaccine chart for people. That every type of virus that you've become a part with, it sends some of its DNA over to us. And so your RNA is essentially like this long report card of all of the different viruses that you've come in contact with. And so using that understanding, people are now able to use a CRISPR, which is the Cas9 protein specifically, to use RNA to allow that protein to specifically target DNA, cut, remove it, and actually replace it with something else, which is leading towards, in the end of our conversation, gene therapies towards reducing, genetic diseases such as, muscular dystrophy or something like that. So that's the brief introduction. I would say that obviously, look at us. We're not bio folks.
Not biochemists?
No.
Yeah, I thought it was.
No. But I think what's really interesting about it, just to kind of segue into the conversation, is that one, the technology exists. Two, it's going to be used on people. It's already used on animals. And as we kind of progress through the conversation, really it's not a debate on whether or not this thing can exist or does exist, because we know it does. The medical community is actually looking at it. They performed like a stop when it first was discovered to say, okay, let's explore the ethical potential downsides or upsides to this technology, and what does it mean for humankind? One of the concerns, to paraphrase and kind of form our discussion, would be, is it ethical for unborn fetuses to be genetically modified to eliminate known diseases that they already can detect in childbirth. Two, is it ethical to modify and or enhance humans? Is it unethical to accept our current state and not want to improve upon it, and or is it unethical to not accept it and want to change it? Then you get to third, which is a geopolitical type of field that says, because the technology exists, is there disproportionate advantages to one side adopting earlier versus another side adopting later? And what type of controls, governance, and or discussion needs to exist to say, hey, we already know how to do it, ish-ly.
Yeah.
Whether it's really successful or not, but should you? And if one country, let's say, because we're Americans here, let's pick on China. If China goes ahead and releases a gene editing program specific to the Olympics, should this or should this not be accepted as being people? So I will stop there. That's a brief overview.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I think you broke it down really well, and maybe we can go through kind of 1 through 4 of what you listed and kind of each talk about that. That may help us to kind of. I know it's going to kind of stem into all the other conversations, but and your number 1 was more towards the just moral standpoint, right? We can start there.
I honestly don't remember.
Okay. Well, let's just start at the kind of the head moral standpoint, if you should or shouldn't.
Well, let's break that down even further. The moral standpoint of, should we be doing this to eradicate different diseases that are located in the DNA that someone's going to have at birth and not develop later? Because I think that's a totally different moral standpoint than using it for other frivolous means. Because I think if we look at it just from the standpoint of wiping out some of these diseases that have affected people for generations and generations and generations, that's definitely something that, as a human peoples everywhere should be interested in eradicating. Even if it seems somewhat unnatural to do it through a means of genetic modification, we're always looking for cures to these diseases and things like that. If the cure to these diseases is to eradicate it at the DNA level, why wouldn't we look into doing that?
Interesting point. Article, MIT Technology Review, dated September 3rd, 2020, entitled "The quote-unquote staged rollout of gene-modified babies could start with sickle cell disease." So again, this is from this year, September. Interestingly enough, when I looked at this article, what I found interesting was it immediately talked about the disproportionate effect of diseases based on ethnic background. And I know that's not, I'm not prepared to talk about that. I don't know anything about it, but when reading the article, that's one thing that stood out. And I'll quote this one little paragraph quick. It says, one example would be 2 people with cystic fibrosis who want to have kids. Such situations are not common, and the panel tried to estimate how often they could arise. For instance, in the U.S., about 1 in 13 African Americans carries the genetic trait for sickle cell disease. Those who inherit 2 copies of the mutation, one at about 350, will develop the condition, which affects the red blood cells and causes painful, life-shortening complications. The report estimated there could be 80 couples, just 80, in the U.S., where both partners have sickle cell diseases. That is a very small group to represent that first idea of, do we ethically incorporate gene therapies or modifications towards a very specific targeted group to allow potentially 80, let's assume they're all just single kids and no twins or triplets, is that ethical or not? I would generally, I think you're saying as well, sure.
I think from a medical standpoint, I think we could probably all agree, and for most people, I think it would be, for the most sake, be accepted as that we should be doing this for the medical purposes. I do think your statement, Ray, about which is kind of interesting, but where it's where someone may look at it from a maybe the other side of the table of going, well, you're editing genes that's not even life yet, or it's beginning of life.
Yeah.
Where that's kind of the piece that they don't see the other side of it as well. If we can't solve these diseases, start somewhere else, from the front end, and not the rear.
Yeah.
And I would add to that as well of just the other maybe counter argument as well is, how do you know it's only affecting that? And I know science is always that way of, you have to continually prove it, and that always happens. But what happens when you get rid of that gene and something else?
Something else pop up somewhere else.
Well, they do see. I'm not prepared to talk about that at all, but there is a long-standing discussion about, we have dormant genes, and those dormant genes that exist specifically make us more or less susceptible to known diseases as they rest now.
Yeah, and that's a reason.
History. Yeah,
there's a reason that they can also jump generations. You can have, your grandparents might have something, your parents don't have it. That doesn't necessarily mean you're safe from not having it. There's all kinds of, diabetes, type 1, and susceptibility to type 2 especially is something that usually, from what you hear, falls at a DNA level. And, I know I have some family members a couple generations back that have it. No one that I know of in my immediate, parents and their siblings has it that I know of, but that doesn't mean I'm not more susceptible or that I wasn't at risk of having type 1 at birth. So it's also hard to say whether changes, like you said, none of us are biologists or, physicians or anything like that. So it's hard to know for sure, but you always hear about DNA being compared to building blocks. So there's also no guarantee that just because you change something in one area, it's going to affect something somewhere else. If you're talking about like building a building out of building blocks, as long as all of your measurements are right, if you change something here to a different material, it's not going to affect something over here.
Well, I think that's really interesting too, because when you hear the scientists who are pioneering this technology, they do liken it to a pair of surgical scissors that are specifically targeting and eliminating specific traits that are outlined by the RNA. They view it as being very targeted and not something that is left up to chance. And I think that's really interesting, because if you, within, let's even say a 30% chance, I think I'm the only one with kids, right?
Yep.
At this point. So when you initially have kids, you do those screenings to see if you're going to have, life-altering diseases or ailments that exist now. And currently, we're tasking parents to really consider that and make judgment calls based on what empirical evidence can be provided through blood sampling or ultrasounds or the measurements between, the different growth stages. That's happening now. And people are making choices about their offspring only based on the empirical evidence that can be gathered. And, that goes into a whole different other topic. But if you could also offer them an alternative to say, instead of, let's use the horrible term, right? Abortion, right? Instead of abortion, could you gene modify that specific trait out with a, let's say, a 60% success rate? Even at that, which is pulled out of my ass completely, I think a lot of people would feel comfortable with that, because it's not so much, in my brain at least, I'm not viewing it as changing life. It's more about securing the future of what already exists.
I think it's more of curing an ailment.
That's a better way to put it.
That's about that's an easy way to dumb it down, is that you're just curing an ailment at the source before it spirals into more of an issue.
Yeah, I don't think it makes it any less of a person, right?
At least at this stage of the conversation, what we're talking about, just medically and related to disease, that's what it is. if you start branching off into all these other aspects of changing height and weight and eye color and stuff like that,
well, let's do
obviously
that because
the
I'm ready
spider
for
web.
that one.
So, but the
Yeah.
other thing I wanted to bring up about this also is, of course, it's going to be up, you know, to the parents and other people involved directly, because not everyone, especially up front, is going to have the means to do this. And it's also going to be up to them whether they believe ethically, whether it's right or wrong.
Sure.
So, you know, you get into those kind of things too.
So it's
some
really
people-
interesting about that, because
Yeah.
you're talking about in that documentary on Netflix called, I pulled it up just because we knew we'd talk about that. Where the hell they go? Unnatural Selection is the name of the documentary. They talked about that if the gene pool is modified and released into nature, then that gene pool will forever be modified.
Yeah.
Does that change your thoughts on it?
It still doesn't change my thoughts, because that just limits the generational risk of that disease becoming prevalent again as well. So I think my opinion's the same on that. But it was more so coming down, my point was also coming down to more of a economic standpoint also.
Okay.
Just people not having the means to do it, and or you bringing up your tie into abortion and stuff like that. There's a lot of families I feel like might not have the option of maintaining a child with a disease like that, because monetarily they wouldn't be able to support that over the life of this offspring that they're considering. So if they were, it also, you know, comes down to, if you're looking at a $40,000 operation before your child is born to eradicate this disease versus possibly millions of dollars over the lifetime of this, but spread out over 30, 40 years or whatever your lifespan would be in the same time that your offspring would be around, you know, at what point does that make it more worth it trying to come up with that up front versus over the life? It just spirals into all kinds of stuff like that.
And if you can't afford it, then it becomes civics' responsibility to care for this child, whether it's in the primary care of its parents or, you know, let go and developed in the system of foster care or whatever. You're right. You still have a sunk cost that exists. And that's, I'm sorry I used that term when talking about a life, but really what you're talking about is, yes, if you have a pre-existing condition that isn't addressed and could be addressed, there is an economic cost that gets distributed to either the parents or the society.
And at what point do people start tying that into a social responsibility for, you know, taxpayers to take on the burden of eradicating at a widespread level, eradicating certain diseases that might affect people disproportionately, and, well, you know, disproportionately not having everyone have access to the same operation and procedures as someone else up front.
Well, I even think it further into instead of just a social responsibility, but government responsibility. How long until a disease comes along that is, you know,
like polio,
black plague, you know, coronavirus, so on and so forth, is, well, I'd like to prevent all of these before you're born. It's a government's responsibility to start adjusting our genes. And then that gets kind of creepy in my mind when it gets to that point.
Kind of. But,
like,
I mean, you also...
from a long-term... And that's, you know, 50 years from now plus.
Yeah.
And but you can kind of get to that point of, well, who's making the judgment call to say this is bad, where you know, someone's dyslexic and they're fantastic at their, and I know I'm not going full on disease versus
ailment
or another type of lesser severe disease, but you go down further and further, what does life become when you start adjusting things that make people who they are?
Yeah. I mean, you also, if you look at it from that standpoint too, you also have, for a lot of public schools and stuff like that, you have required vaccinations and stuff like that. You know, at what point does this become required for your child to go to school to be eradicated of whatever this disease might be? Would we eventually put it into that same category, is what I'm trying to say, or would it 100% fully be up to the parent and people involved?
I think it would have to go to that point where it's a social and a government, especially, you know, what we're going through now with coronavirus. If you could have, you know, and I know some of this is unknown and diseases that we're going to start to see over the lifetime. We're not going to have a solve for all of them, but if there are these major ones, say coronavirus doesn't go away and is just always here, well, you're going to have the next generation using this to prevent mass deaths in the entire world. So I think it gets really
Well, there was a study that was released this week that said that the severe cases of coronavirus, right, where they experience some symptoms that are more severe. Small study, not proven overall, but generally what they're saying is that there's an autoantibody developed that specifically targets interferon, which sounds like a Scientology term. But either way, that yes, the principle of what you're saying is that can diseases be less effective if we target specific genes that are known to leave you more susceptible? Small cases even this week that are published that says yes, that is true. And so I think you have merit in what you're saying is all I'm trying to say.
Well, yeah, no, I definitely see. I think that my eyes, I see this splitting two ways. First, it's let's solve diseases. Then it goes to becoming into the wealthy
modification.
So I'm total on modification.
We can dive into that.
Let's just dive in it because I support it.
And maybe let me even go further than that. Then I sound like I'm making up a freaking movie, but you go from diseases to modifications to then that government piece that I was talking about into the back end of controlling the population and what they can be susceptible to and not, and so on and so forth. So I know I'm making some Steven Spielberg movie right there, but
you're really not, because people have talked about this in conspiracy theories for quite a bit. Now,
you already have. I mean, I don't know how verified this is, but you always hear about governments and other countries limiting births to certain genders that are falling behind and stuff like that. At what point does that not become the same thing here?
100%.
On the principle, you're not wrong. But I think that for enhancements specifically, I think it's a selfish notation of the older generation that views that this, whatever we could be, is limited to what my current capacity allows. And it's for that specific reason that I'm not against modifications in general, because as we talked in the very beginning about Starlink, affording, or whatever word you want to use, opportunities to folks who may not otherwise have it. If there is a genetic, and I'm not talking about Nazi bullshit, I'm talking about just if people, humans in general, have the ability to make us better, we're fucked up as it is. Either if someone who whether you say has a complete lack of empathy, or who, we have savants, right, that show up in different things that progress those to the next level. And I'm not talking about eliminating those, but I'm just saying that if we in general can say, can we improve the human race in some level, even marginally, and it could be universally applied, right? We're not talking about the advantages, disadvantages. We're not talking about, all those other economic things that exist, but just in general, if you could take away a failure of ours that we know we have as a species and address it to make it so, in general, the world's population has a better quality of life, I am for it.
But when you take it down to that level, I agree. It's just all of the spin-offs from there that start to get muddy.
It's the universal bit.
That's right.
Where I think this, this wealth of knowledge, this, amazing technology comes out, but that's what's going to affect first.
Why are we so afraid of having, this is really a genuine question. Our fear is not that we can make people better. Our fear is that it's disproportionately applied.
Oh, 100%.
our fear is that we won't be selected or our kids won't be selected, so therefore we're at a further disadvantage.
Yeah.
We have disadvantaged people all over the globe, but that's the actual fear, is that saying if we can, which we feel like we can at this point with CRISPR. So the real question is not, is it good to? It's really, how do we make it so other people aren't left behind? Because empathically, we all say, yes, progress is better as long as everyone's on the same stage.
Yeah, and I think this becomes, depending on what CRISPR is able to do, but
And at what price point?
at
This
some
might be
point,
like any tech sector. This could be something that only the elites can use, but it might end up becoming more widespread to the point where if you're going to have a child, it's $200 per option that you want to add on to your child.
Yep.
Yeah, blue eyes,
It's-
green eyes.
It's going into a car dealership and selecting your kid.
And it just is odd because it's so heavily dependent on who takes this technology and where it goes. Because if you do start having government intervention, and then it's up to governments to decide who gets what, who's allowed to do what, that's when you start running into the Nazism issues and things like that, where you've got one person that's in power that has an ideal person or an ideal outline of the perfect person that they want to be, and then they're going to try and cater an entire people to that, and possibly try and eradicate everything that doesn't fall into that line, which there's no guarantee that that's where it would go. But I think that is one fear that's always in the back of people's minds.
And I think a big piece of this too is, I feel like this jumps a little bit different than, say, monetarily. Someone could have $1 million and you can have $10 in your bank. Yes, there's a difference there, but you're still humans. And I think at this point you start adding, he's faster, he's stronger, he's taller, all of those things that get added into it. I feel like that jump becomes so much larger, and I think that's why there's such a large fear there, is this isn't something you can just lose or you can take away. What happens when it's a superhero? It's, those type of things that...
It's something that's so basic in your genealogy that gap is not able to be overcome by any other means other than genetic modification at that point.
Yep.
And I would challenge that in the simple thing that if you look overall, and I'm trying to formulate this as I'm talking it, but if you look overall towards what societies value, generally it's not physical traits.
Yeah.
Throughout history, yes, we have physical traits that we view, but that's changed. It's not been consistent over time. Statures of wealth, used to be you were obese and had a bunch of children, and now it's, statures of wealth are physical based, which no one really gives a shit about. But overall, the traits and the qualities that define humanity are put a lot of value in differences.
Yeah.
And we can go through cases where people bring up provide motivation and I think for where they overcome adversity. I don't think in the week's worth of research I've done that adversity would go away if the bar was universally raised from here to here, and the quality of life of individuals who are not trying to struggle, right? We want everyone to be fair, not equal, right? And I think I view that as a truth, that we all aren't equal, but we should all have a fairness in our lives. And if you could receive or create a fair existence across the globe based on eliminating genetic failures that exist through our biology, there, I can avoid all conflicts by just saying biology, then I'm for it. I really am. I think that we can create a better future if everyone's on a fair playing field, not equal.
Yeah, and I agree with you. My point was more so devil's advocate to that, because I do think it can be done widespread, but I think it's going to take a hell of a person to want to capitalize on that for the betterment of humanity versus the betterment of themselves. Because you look at other tech factors and medical availability and stuff like that, and even though those are things that could unequivocally be catered to the betterment of society, they aren't always played that way.
You're talking about food deserts, but now for biology.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it would be a similar kind of thing. So
yeah.
yeah, it
Access
just
to it would
that's
be a
also yeah.
crazy
I mean
thing.
that ties into my point of it depends on who takes this and runs with it. You know,
Yeah, that's where
if
it's
it's
going
the
to
right
stem.
person, that's great. If it's the wrong person, it could go the totally opposite way. So
Yeah, and I think
it's just hard to know.
I'm sure that's what half the discussions of when they did stop this is the morality of what this could become and worst case scenario and all of that. But you think of everything as super soldiers to yes to solving diseases. I think that's in my eyes that's my biggest worry, that this becomes such a
Polarizing.
polarizing topic where it becomes where it's a social status. It's a
Yeah.
just because I feel like that's a lot of what our society is. I know we want fairness for everybody, but that doesn't always happen, and so
Right.
that's where I just truly, as you said right there too, Ray, of even medically, we're not all covered the same, and so if we were to ask everybody, 10 people on the street, could you go get plastic surgery? No. you know 2 people out of those 10 or something like that, so on and so forth. I think it just builds to
That's looking at us in the U.S. And if you look at that throughout different countries,
oh
you're going to
100%.
get both ends of the spectrum, right? Where you're
Yeah.
saying that, yeah, you've got places
Everybody-
that
Saudi Arabia can get it, but we can't.
Yeah, it just that's why I worded it the way that I did, because it
Yeah.
does vary depending on where you're at.
Oh,
And it's going to be like, there's always give and takes to that. Other countries might have more access to this through healthcare because they have universal healthcare, but where does that detract from in other areas? There's always going to be a give and take. That's where the argument of is this a societal issue or is this a personal issue also comes into play.
Yeah, and I would say that, when we see assisted suicide, right? We've seen in the past 2 months, Denmark or the Netherlands, one of the two. I'm sorry, I should have been more prepared, but you're just bringing it up. But anyway, I think it's the Netherlands. They said that assisted suicide is fine at this point, and that if you're a minority, you just need parental consent for assisted suicide, based on things that can't or aren't currently. Yeah, no, seriously, dude, I see your wrinkled brow, but yes. Parental consent for assisted suicide in Denmark was approved last month. And essentially what it is saying that for these genetic diseases that can't be addressed, and you have these long-term life, threatening, continual pain, agony, can you get out of it? Very few countries around the world say yes, right?
Yeah.
The Kevorkian thing still exists, even though in the States here we said no. But elsewhere, sure. And I think that's what you're talking about too, Ray, is that healthcare is viewed differently around the world. And circle back to the beginning of the conversation, that's where the concern comes from, is say, if a country adopts early genetic modification to be overall fine, do they have a disproportionate advantage over others, say 2 generations down the road? Is that or is that not bad? I would generally say it's okay.
Yeah, I think I would generally lean that direction.
Yeah, I think there's so much to this that to see how it ends
And
up,
it's
it
just-
will be interesting.
Yeah, so much of it is also unknown. It's all speculation and conjecture as of this point. There's
Yeah.
nothing that's proven that it would go one way or the other.
Yeah.
That's the other hard part. You can talk about morality all you want when it's in its infancy like this, but we're by no means going to come up with any way to rolled this out in a fair and equal manner.
Yeah.
on this
It's all
podcast,
skepticism and
It's going to happen.
And-
It is happening currently.
yeah.
Yeah.
And what's after this?
It's been going on for a long time.
Yeah. The earliest cases were in the
I should
80s.
say.
Yeah. No, it has been.
I mean,
going on for quite some time.
you brought up Nazis before. You can trace this all the way back to the Germans were trying to do it in the middle of World War II. But they were trying to do it from that super soldier standpoint, trying to breed their people the best to overtake what they were looking at. This is definitely not a new concept. This goes back decades and decades and decades.
And I would generally say probably the most controversial comment is that if you could take people and we'll quantify that saying everybody has the same access to, let's say, reduce back injuries by increasing something related to whether it's the spatial disc, the the cartilage, the muscle. If you could go and say, hey, everybody in the world could not have basic back injuries from X, but the trade-off is genetic mutation, I'm fine.
I guarantee there's a lot of chiropractors that won't be happy with you.
Yeah, I don't give a shit. No, I'm literally like, if you were to frame up any discussion that says this, not saying could you jump higher, but saying could you reduce obesity by 37% by modifying this gene and making it common practice in all fetal tissue, I would generally say, okay.
Yeah. If they're going to, like you said, apply it to all evenly as a standard process, then yeah, absolutely.
Yes, but if you then said this technology exists and it is $9,000 for anybody who wants to do it, do I still support it? This is where I get on the fringe and say, yes, I do.
Yeah.
I 100% do, because I know the cost of business, that even if $9,000, which I fundamentally would argue that insulin should not be as expensive as it is, right? Because that's a life-saving. But if you were to say, would you like to increase the chances 30% that your child would not insert X? Sure. I'm okay with paying that premium. Yeah. Even if I can't afford it, I think that in the infancy stage of it, could you? Sure. Should you? Yeah. If the technology exists for you to get a 30% increase on a better quality of life for your child, should it be a commercial offering for you? Yes.
Yeah. No, I from the ethical and medical standpoint, I agree 100% on all of that. I think my big hang-up's all the other stuff, that how it rolls out, what happens after, what this becomes, because this isn't just going to stop here.
No.
So
that's someone's going to be... What's that injection that people do? That they put saline in their muscles to make them look stupid?
Synthol.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I could see the synthol kids getting on this going, look, I can have a smaller nose and let's make the new fad to make... I said that because of mine. But, like a 1 centimeter nose that still has full smell.
Yeah, there's a lot there. So...
How cool is that, though, that, we're all nerds, right? Who's excited for Cyberpunk?
Yeah.
Yeah.
If it would roll out.
If it ever will. But when it does, that's what's what really exciting about it, is that it's exploring those concepts that allows us to go, what are the potential downsides, upsides through a narrative for things like we're talking about cybernetic enhancements on this side, but genetic enhancements, that's what our conversation is.
Yeah, and it comes down to almost the same denominator. You're trying to increase quality of life in one aspect or another, whether it be through cybernetics or genetic mutation.
And everyone knows there's going to be intrinsic downsides. Yeah. There's going to be people who bastardize it. There's going to be people who can't afford it. There's going to be the left behinds. There's going to be the successors. There's going to be all those caste systems that exist throughout all societies that has happened since the beginning of time. That's the conversation. Not necessarily should it exist, because it already does. You can't stop it.
Yeah. That's exactly it. Well, we're approaching the 40-minute mark. So, any kind of final thoughts on the topic from either of you? I know
I
there's a
think we
lot there.
touched on everything that I had researched and wanted to talk about. So, without doing another couple months worth of research, that's my limit of knowledge on this topic.
Yeah.
I'm saying in 5 years, this is going to be something that everyone is going to be selecting a la carte at a pregnancy. It has to be.
Yep.
It's here. We can't stop it.
Yep.
I think it's coming. And regardless of what our perceptions are on how it can be bastardized, 5 years, based on what I'm seeing now, you're going to start to be able to select. And I don't think there's a really intrinsic falsehood or otherwise detriment to parents saying blue eyes or green.
No, I don't either.
No.
If that's what they want, for their child, and they're willing to pay for it, then yeah.
Having kids, I don't think people should fucking care what the color of the eyes are.
Yeah.
Right? Every kid is an individual. I'm not advocating for choosing, but I'm just saying that we can, and if someone gives a shit, fine. They're still going to be a kid, and they're still going to be their own individual, regardless of their eye color. But if somehow the quality of life of the upbringing is better enhanced by the color of their eyes based on their parents', I don't know, what do you call it, inability to comprehend how life works, fine. It's whatever. But it's happening. We have the ability now. It's going to happen. Let's not get hung up on whether or not it should, because it is, and it will. Let's focus on more so how do we make it available to everyone to increase the total ability of people to benefit. That's all.
No,
that's my big moment.
That's perfect. That's where we'll kind of head on out. So we appreciate you guys stopping by, listening. This is our deeper dive onto a single topic this week, which we chose CRISPR. We'll do these probably once a month, so just kind of keep your eyes out for it. Once again, we are the Countertop Podcast, Apple Music, Spotify, Twitch, Twitter. Maybe we'll game. We're thinking about gaming. See? There we go. YouTube, all of them. Just go follow us. Give us a like. Give us a comment. We appreciate it. Thanks, guys.
See ya.
See ya.